In this session, we're going to take a look at database management in EventSentry, especially for the built-in PostgreSQL-based database. Now, with database management, I mean identifying which features use up the most space in the database, how can we clean up space in the database, and also identify features that have changed their usage pattern, for example, by starting to record more and more space in the database than they used to. The database is obviously a central component in EventSentry that stores all data. And depending on which database you're using, we support both Microsoft SQL Server-based databases as well as a built-in Postgres database. And regardless of which database you're using, of course, we want to make sure that we have sufficient disk space available on the drive where the database is stored, and also make sure it's performing well index-wise and so forth. A good starting point is always the default dashboard that has a database summary tile that you can see in the top left here. So what we can see here is we can see the total size of the database, in this case 113 gigabytes. We can see approximately how much gigabytes per day are being added on, so there'll be 8 gigs a day in this example. We can see how much time the data spans, in this case 14 days. So of course there's clearly a job set up somewhere that purges data that's older than 14 days. And we can also see how much disk space is available on the drive where the database is stored. Now, this is something that's only available for Postgres databases. If you're storing this on a remote database or remote SQL Server database, of course, then we eventually will not have that information unless you're also monitoring that host with EventSentry, in which case you'd have to look that information up with disk space monitoring. More information is available in the actual database usage page. So if you go to settings and click on database usage, then there are a lot more details available as to the database health, size, and so forth. So this page has been improved in version 5.1 compared with previous releases. And in this example, we're looking at a local database. So we're looking at the built-in EventSentry Postgres database. Now here we can see the server where the database is running, IP address, which port it's listing on, all the local drives and their disk space. And then we have details on the actual database. So for example, the settings for the database, which is important for performance, the workmem, maintenance workmem, auto vacuum settings, shared buffers, the version of the database and so forth. And of course, the size of the database comprised of the data and the index. Below that, we have the maintenance jobs, and that's actually where you configure how long data is actually stored in the database. So in this case, we have 2 database jobs set up. One is called standard, one is called logs. The standard one purchases anything that's older than 45 days at 11 p.m. And then there's a second job that purchases everything apparently related to logs, and we can take a look at that at 3 a.m. And that only keeps the data for 14 days. So looking at this here, if we click the edit button, we can see, okay, so this job essentially deletes all syslog and event log data that is older than 14 days. So the end result is going to be that all data is going to be available in the database for 45 days, with the exception of logs, which are only kept for 14 days. So by setting up 2 jobs, you can sort of create a custom setup where certain data is kept for a longer period of time and other is kept for shorter periods of time, depending on your needs and of course the disk space that you have available. And talking about disk space that is available, it is important to note that Postgres is not like running out of disk space. So we highly recommend keeping an eye on the available disk space on the drive where the database is, and once that disk space gets slow, doing the maintenance jobs and the purge jobs then, and not to wait until there's no more disk space available at all. We do offer some utilities as part of the sysadmin tools that can help if the database is actually has completely filled up your data drive. So there are ways to get around it, but it's going to be more time consuming and may also result in temporary downtime of the database. Now that we've looked at the overall capacity of the database server performance settings, available disk space, the maintenance jobs, we can now focus on the actual features that are storing data in the database to identify which features use up the most space. And this is easily visible here because it's sorted by the rows by default, and you can also sort by data, of course, but usually they're very similar when it comes to the database usage. And the biggest space hog, if you will, in this case is the event search page, so event logs, which is going to be the case in most scenarios, most installations. The next one is performance history, so that's performance data we're collecting from Windows. And then finally, process system information. So this is associated usually with process activity, also uses a lot of space. So now that you're looking to reduce the amount of space you're using, you can focus on these features to see, okay, what can I do to clean up space here? Options for performance data, for example, would be to say, maybe we can store fewer counters, or we want to store counters less frequently. You can review the settings in the management console to see how often is data written to the database. For event search, well, there you'd want to look at the actual event search page to see if there are events that we don't need. Windows does log a lot of information to the security event log, and not all of it is useful and necessary for compliance and forensics. So it's not necessary to simply turn on all audit options in Windows, fill up the security event log, and store all that in the database. There's a lot of information that is unnecessary and that will literally just pollute your database and use up unnecessary space. And if we extrapolate that over, months and years, then we can literally look at terabytes of space being used for no reason. So definitely recommended to look at the event search page to see, okay, what type of event IDs are we storing and are those necessary? And if you're unsure whether a particular event is necessary to be kept, then you can always go to our System 32 site, enter the event ID that you're concerned about. Let's say, for example, 4625. And then you can take a look here to get an explanation, see whether this event should even be audited. It will give you an estimate on the volume. It will tell you which compliance requirements this is useful for. And then you can make the determination, okay, do I need this event or not? So obviously, if you, in this particular case, this is an event you'll definitely want in the database, but there are others that you may not necessarily need in the database. So 4656, for example, is a handle to an object was requested. So here we recommend that it's generally not necessary to keep this event, and the volume is potentially very high. So if you see a lot of these events, for example, then you may be able to just simply exclude that event and save some disk space. So use that site to get a general idea of, okay, well, what type of events may I not need? Another useful metric is the trends column. That will let you know if the volume of data being stored by a particular feature, such as log on by type, for example, changed significantly. So if we scroll down here, most of them are the same. So if your data patterns, the amount of volume that's being stored by features generally the same, then that will just be a straight line like you see here. But if something changes, let's say you make a configuration change that suddenly causes a feature to log, let's say 3 times as much data, and that could be by accident or it could be somebody else doing that, then you will see that here. So if you look here, I already selected this line here, so let's unselect this. Here you can see that the trend line goes up quite a bit, and that's something that I artificially created for another video. It was increasing the number of emails, which resulted in that action history table to increase in size. It's a very small table, so this is not significant here for database usage, but it does sort of illustrate the usefulness of this trend column. And down here, similar for object tracking, you can see that on that one day, it really increased, and you can click that here and I see more details, right? So this is a good way to spot sort of anomalies and saying, oh no, we've increased. Obviously, we're storing more events, for example, and this features is really starting to use up a lot more space in the database. So you can look at that to find the culprit before it starts using up your database. So it may not be storing that much data, but you can notice trends there. So that's always useful, when you're investigating database usage. Now, if you did identify a feature that is using too much space, then there are a few options. If it's the event search page, so event logs, then try to identify the events that you potentially don't need and exclude them from being sent to the database. I mentioned the 4656 example earlier, so you can actually go into the EventSentry management console here. The package that is responsible for writing all data to the database is the database consolidation package. And that by default has 3 filters in it that send pretty much all data to the database, depending on how you install EventSentry. And if you, for example, say, okay, there's specific events I don't want to go into the database, an easy option is to simply create a folder here, call it exclusions. and then add another filter, and we want an exclude filter because we want to block this from going to the database. We can say security 4656. The primary database is already selected, so this filter will affect the primary database. We're looking for, let's say, any audit success or failure events. The event ID is going to be 4656. And the event source can be left empty here since we are talking about just the security event log, but we can type audit here and select the Microsoft Windows Security Auditing source. So that's the main event source that Microsoft uses. So once I have this enabled here, that 4656 event is not going to be written to the database anymore. If the database usage is high for something else, for example, performance data, like I mentioned, then you can adjust how often is performance data written to the database. So that is under System Health. And here we have various performance packages. The performance system is the one that records most of the features by default. And here you can see that these features are writing data to the database every 15 minutes. So that's actually not too bad and shouldn't result in that much data. But for example, if that is too much, there's another package here called performance applications that also writes every 15 minutes, but has potentially more data because it records data for every instance. Right, so here for every process that runs on your systems is going to store the average CPU handle count in memory. And if you say, you know what, for handles, I don't really need to write this every 15 minutes, every hour is sufficient, and we can simply change this to 1 hour, and we're now reducing the amount of data by 75%. So similar things can be done with memory. You can say, okay, but I don't really need to know the memory every 15 minutes. I can increase this to 30. This is not going to have a large effect if you have a small installation with just, let's say, 10 servers and 20 workstations. But on larger installations, that can accumulate to be a lot of space that you're saving. And if all that doesn't help, then you can always set up a separate purge jobs and delete or keep data for less amount of time. So in this particular case, for example, ESP is tracking sysmon network. So sysmon data seems to be using up a lot of space. So if you said, okay, I only want to keep this data here, for example, for 2 weeks as well, then we could edit this job here and add the process sysmon to this job, for example, and say, okay, well, we only want to keep that data for 14 days as well. I'm not going to do that here. We don't have a space issue. But those are some of the options that are available to you to reduce the amount of data that's being stored, written to the database.